This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping take your leadership to the next level. And here to help us do that, the one and only Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Good to be with you, Sam.
Good to be with you too, Richard. You've got sort of a monumental task ahead of you in about a week, and you're running your first half marathon.
I know.
I never thought I'd see the day, Richard, to be honest.
You have little faith.
If you go back to the first maybe 2 or 3 episodes of this podcast a couple of years ago, you were
mocking me.
I wasn't mocking you. I would just maybe just poking a little and jesting.
Then I couldn't even run a 5K.
Yeah, that was the goal. I remember in episodes 1 and 2.
And then a 10K was like my long-term goal.
Yeah,
and I did that last July, and then I got up to 10 miles just about a week ago.
Yeah. So just one pandemic later, and here you are.
Trying to bring something good out of
running
a
half marathon. So
this coming Sunday, actually, I'll be the half marathon, and it'll be I don't know. I've never run more. I've only run 10 miles once, and so this is 3 miles more than that. But it's kind of funny the way they do that. The pre-training, if you're going to run 13.1 miles, they tell you don't ever run more than 10, kind of in training. And then on the day, you add 3 miles to your longest run. It's kind of
But once you get into that territory, it's like, well, what's another 3 miles?
Yeah, well, we'll see. I'll find out soon enough what another 3 miles.
Oh, you'll feel those last 3 miles.
Well, I was feeling the last 9 and 10 miles there the other day, but that was I was pushing it to the limit. So
running it helps to give you perspective.
Yeah, I will tell you, to blow my own horn because I haven't run the half marathon yet, but even running 10 miles really was a push for me. But to me, it's about finding something that you have to set goals and will yourself to do. And I think everybody should have some kind of stretch goal. Just, it could be learning a language, learning to play the piano or an instrument, but something that is hard and that pushes you and is a worthy goal and something worthwhile to achieve and accomplish. And so for me, I guess the last little bit it's run a half marathon. I've got no illusions. Don't just slap me if I even mention thinking about a full marathon. But half marathon to me is sort of like, I always thought maybe that would be that's my stretch goal. And I don't plan to run a lot of those, but I'd like to have at least run one. Yeah. And I think a 10K is kind of a nice sort of normal stretch for me. But anyway, I think for our listeners, I would challenge every one of you listening to this podcast. What is the stretch goal you're pushing yourself for right now?
Yeah.
Always have something that you're trying to do.
Well, and you can do it either within your wheelhouse, within your skill set. You can push yourself even higher, or you can do something outside your skill set.
Yeah,
that's going to be hard.
Right, and it might be harder. It's outside your skill set. So.
Exactly, and so I think there's a lot of ways that we can push ourselves.
I think it engages your brain differently too. Things like a language and stuff. Sometimes you might be really good at one area of thinking, but then this area uses brain cells that normally don't get put into motion. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and all that can bring perspective to one's life.
Nice segue there, Sam.
Yeah.
I want to talk in this podcast just a little bit about perspective. It's there's just a couple of things. And next week I've got another kind of issue like that as well, but. There's an interesting story, I might mention it before, of Dwight Eisenhower. When he was getting ready for D-Day, he was over in England, and they were moving all the forces over there, ready to do that huge invasion of the continent. And his son had joined the army, and his son was the lowest ranking officer that you could be in the U.S. Army. And of course, Eisenhower was the highest ranking officer that you could be in the Army. And so they're walking around. So he's got his son kind of over visiting with him. And so they're out walking around the base where they were. And of course, every soldier that walks by and sees the top commander walking with his son, they're all saluting him. And so his son, has these officers saluting in his direction too. And so he feels that he needs to also salute. But of course, no one really cares about him. He's like the lowest possible officer you could be. But he's kind of a little discombobulated to say, well, so he finally says to his dad, well, we got to figure out a system here because, you're such a the highest ranking military officer, and I'm not at your rank, obviously. And so when someone salutes in our direction, what do we do? And Eisenhower just said to his son, well, son, there's nobody in this entire country, in this entire theater, who ranks lower than you. He said, you are the lowest ranking officer that there is. And he said, and there's no one in this theater who ranks higher than me. So he said, we're at the two extreme ends. And Eisenhower wasn't really fretting about it. It was the flunky, the young guy just starting out, that was all uptight about protocol and what do you do. And I always sort of got a kick out of that, to think that the two perspectives, the one leader just starting out and all stressed out about all these different things, and then the veteran guy at the top who've been at it for a while, totally different perspective. So they're both having the exact same thing happen to them. They're walking side by side, but they're seeing it completely differently. Yeah. And it just reminds me that in life, especially as a leader, we kind of go through stages in our life. We start out obviously as young leaders. For most of us, we start out leading young. And the longer we're at it and in the game, sometimes our perspective changes. And I think both perspectives have merit to them and cautions to them. And what I wanted us to do is just look for a moment at the life of Moses. And I think that we're very familiar with these stories, but there's two kind of interesting perspectives on him. And one is found in Acts chapter 7. In Acts 7, of course, is the sermon that Stephen, the deacon, if you will, is going to preach right before he gets stoned to death. This sermon is not going to go well, and he's going to end up dead as a result of it. But in chapter 7, at a certain point, about verse 20, he says, "At this time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight," which I think is kind of a cool phrase. He was cared for in his father's home for 3 months. When he was put outside, Pharaoh's daughter adopted and raised him as her own son. So Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in his speech and actions. When he was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. When he saw one of them being mistreated, he came to his rescue and avenged the oppressed man by striking down the Egyptian. He assumed his people would understand that God would give them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. The next day he showed up while they were fighting and tried to reconcile them peacefully, saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why are you mistreating each other?" But the one who was mistreating his neighbor pushed Moses aside, saying, "Who appointed you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me the same way you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When he heard this, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian. Interesting account. And there's a couple things that are kind of interesting about this. Of course, one, in verse 22, Stephen says that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And of course, the Egyptians are the world's superpower at the time, very influential and powerful and sophisticated. He's got the best education, basically, that's available at the time. Right. He's got an MBA from Harvard, if you will. And it says he's powerful in his speech and actions. Now,
which is interesting.
It's interesting because we're going to see in a moment that in Exodus chapter 4, he's going to argue then, 40 years later, that he is not eloquent of speech. He says, "I'm not a good speaker." But in when he's 40, when he's essentially a young man, the Bible says he was actually quite eloquent. He's powerful in speech and powerful in actions and very well educated. And so, but then when he basically the first time he tries to lead, he finally, when he's about 40, he's got all of his education, all of his trainings behind him. He decides maybe it's time to get in the game here. So he goes to visit his Israelite brethren and sees an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew, and ultimately kills the Egyptian. And the next day he comes and it's like, okay, I'm starting to try to help my people here. I'm this powerful speaker and leader, and now what else can I do to fix things? And he sees two Hebrews, one kind of oppressing the other. He steps in to fix that, and it's not received well. And it's interesting, it says he assumed his people would understand that God would give them deliverance through him. Of course, he thinks, I was raised in Pharaoh's home. Like, I've got the best education of any Hebrew on the planet. I've got connections. I've got all the degrees, the training. If there's anyone that is groomed and obvious to be a leader, it's me, and it should be obvious to them. But when he speaks up with his eloquent speech, instead of people recognizing that he is obviously gifted and the man for the hour, the guy sort of mocks him, pushes him aside, ignores him, says, basically, I'm not going to follow you. And basically Moses is going to run to the wilderness and spend the next 40 years shepherding sheep. From being a prince in the most powerful country in the land, he's going to go to being a shepherd of sheep in the backside of the desert for 40 years.
Well, it sounds like that was a self-imposed, self-inflicted period of his life. Because I don't know that he had to necessarily flee.
Well, it says, in Exodus, I think it says that that Pharaoh sought to kill him. So, I think he was put on as a wanted man, which it's kind of funny that Pharaoh would do that. He raised him as like a grandson, I guess. But
yeah.
But it says he was a marked man, and I guess word got out that what he'd done, there's several things I think about Moses in his early days that I think are interesting. One is he was overconfident. He looked at his education and so on, his youth, his vigor, his enthusiasm, his energy level, his physical strength, his mind is working sharp. And he figures, I can take on the world. You know, I can change the world. I can move mountains. But it's confidence without experience. He's never done any of this before. And I can tell you, there are a lot of people getting their MBAs or getting their masters of theology degrees in seminaries that have all these dreams of the businesses they're going to start when they finish their degree, or the church they're going to start or grow, and sometimes even parents, were anticipating having their first child, and what a great parent they'll be, and but no one told them about colic and babies that cry hour after hour all
no one
night.
mentioned the sleepless nights that would be involved.
Yeah, and just all the stress, and when people don't just respond to your leadership, wait a minute, I'm the boss here. I'm the manager. You're supposed to just recognize my infinite wisdom and do what I say, but instead they're resisting. They're arguing with me. They're not following through and doing what I told them to do. And so there's overconfidence in a lot of times for spiritual leaders. There's a shallow walk with God. A lot of young guys, they tend to be action oriented and think, I'll pray, but I'm going to get out there and make it happen. Yeah. We don't really hear of Moses talking to God back in that day. We don't hear Moses praying and saying, God, what should I do with these Hebrews that are fighting? He just assumes he knows and doesn't necessarily rely upon God. He just kind of figures, hey, I've got the best education around. I'm a man of action. I'll handle this myself. And of course,
the highest ranking Hebrew.
Yeah, and it blows up in his face. And sometimes when you're young, you have unrealistic expectations. You just assume, well, I'll do this and they'll do that, and it won't take a lot of effort, or people will be reasonable, they'll be rational, they'll recognize what's good for them, and they'll be glad that I'm going to work it out on their behalf. and then it doesn't work out that way. And so what happens sometimes is that, especially when we're younger, our own self-image is not always very accurate. Sometimes we have a too high a view of ourselves, and we're too confident. Our confidence level is not really based on experience, and because of that, we expect the wrong things. And what you realize in a nutshell for him is, number one, Moses didn't know people very well. He assumed he knew people and he knew how to work with them and how they would respond, but he hadn't done a lot of work with people yet, at least that we know of. Certainly hadn't worked with the Hebrews before, and so when you don't know people well, if all you know about people is what you read in books, you've got a lot to learn still.
Yeah.
And it also, he didn't know himself very well. Here this guy is so confident. He's a prince of Egypt, and he's well-educated and trained. And basically, he has experiences one failure, and it so demoralizes him that he spends 40 years in hiding as a result. How can you go from being this prince swaggering around the country, and then one failure is all it takes to rattle you, and you assume that you're done, that it's impossible. And sadly, I would just say, especially for younger leaders, be very careful about those failures, because failures are going to happen, and how you handle that failure is going to mean everything. For some people, they tried once, it didn't work, they've never tried it again 30 years later. And the fact is, like I've talked to some young pastors who the first church they went to was a completely dysfunctional church. Satan had a hand, just under lock and key, and these young, naive, sort of optimistic people had no idea that God's people could be so ugly and so wicked at times, and they chewed him up and spit him out. And so the pastor assumes, I guess I'm just not called into ministry. I guess I'm just not good at this. Well, the fact is, even a veteran pastor would have really struggled with people that carnal, power structures that entrenched over the years. Yeah. But because they had an early failure, now they see themselves as a failure, and they go into exile like Moses and walk away. And it's tragic oftentimes. And so they make the wrong assumptions about themselves. They overconfident maybe to begin with, and then demoralized afterward. And both perspectives aren't actually accurate. And then lastly, Moses just didn't know God very well. So he didn't know people well enough. He didn't know himself well enough, and he didn't know God well enough. And of course, you don't expect that from necessarily a young leader just starting out.
Right.
But you've got to be aware of that. You've got to be aware to say, I don't know God like I should. I better be spending a lot of time trying to get to know him and praying and seeking his counsel and guidance. And I don't know people as well as I should. I need to be asking a lot of questions. I need to be talking to veteran leaders and getting their perspective and advice on things. And I don't know myself. You think you're an expert on yourself, but we often deceive ourselves. We often make assumptions. A lot of times people don't challenge us on our own self-perception. Like I assume that, Sam, you know yourself well, so even when you say things that might seem kind of inconsistent to me, I just assume, well, but I mean, who am I to say, Sam, are you sure that, that's how you are? Are you sure you're good at that? You talk like you're good at that, but I've not seen it, But we tend to not do that and challenge people about their view of themselves.
Right.
I assume you're an expert on yourself, but so we can end up with some real blind spots because no one, especially in our young days, has said, hey, you need to, I think you need a bit of humbling there, my friend.
Yeah, you're actually not that good at that.
I'm not quite sure how to say this, Sam, but there's still room for improvement. And so, you're vulnerable at times as a young leader, and I think Moses was, obviously. And it cost him 40 years in the wilderness for him to grow up in the process.
Well, let's take a quick break here, and we'll come back. Once a quarter, Richard Blackaby gives a conference call devotional for marketplace leaders in partnership with Workforce Ministries. Connect with this call via Zoom or on the telephone. The next call will be held on Wednesday, February 24th at noon Eastern Time. Visit workforceministries.org for the phone number and for the Zoom link. Links will also be in the show notes. All right, Richard. Well, just as we close here, what are some other takeaways from this experience with Moses that we can apply?
Yeah. So we looked at Acts 7 and Stephen's take on Moses, but then you get to Exodus chapter 3 and 4, and you see the other side. Now Moses is 80. He's an older guy now. Mm-hmm. And of course, famously in Exodus 3, he encounters God in a burning bush, and God says, I'm going to deliver the Israelites from Egypt, and Moses, I'm going to use you. And right away, for 2 chapters, Moses argues and frets and comes up with excuses. And he says, well, who am I that you would do that? I'm just a shepherd. That's all I am. And then he gets to chapter 4, and he says in verse 10, he says, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, either in the past or recently, or since you have been speaking to your servant. Because my mouth and my tongue are sluggish. Now, that you kind of wonder, well, Stephen said that he was eloquent, he was powerful in speech and word. And now, 40 years later, Moses is saying, I'm sluggish in speech. I've got a thick tongue. I can't. Of course, all he's spoken to in 40 years, besides his family, has been sheep. He spends a lot of time alone, day after day, where he just has to holler out stuff, instructions to his sheep. And so now he feels like, I'm not a speaker. I can't do that. And of course, the big question is, well, which is right? Was Stephen right, or was Moses right when he was 80? Because it seems like when Moses was a young man, he saw himself as powerful in speech and an obvious leader that people should recognize. But now he's 40 years later, he's like, I'm not a leader. I'm not a speaker. So did he change, or did his perspective change? Now, obviously, he would have been rusty because he hadn't spoken to any audience bigger than a flock of sheep for 40 years. But did he have that ability, or did his perspective change? And I would suggest to you that oftentimes leaders, as the years go by, their perspective changes a bit, and not always for the best. Sometimes I find leaders, they become more cynical as they get older. They've tried things and it hasn't worked. They tried to lead and people didn't respond. They tried to change things and it didn't work. People resisted change. And so as you get older as a leader, when you were young, you thought you could change anything. Yeah. And now you're older and you start to get tired and you start to get cynical and you start to think, I've tried that before, it didn't work. Yeah. And you can sometimes tell, and of course, older people sometimes can become famous for this. You get a lot of old people in your church. You want to change something. Well, we tried that back in the 60s and it didn't last, didn't work, or we tried that and nobody liked it, and there was just a lot of grumbling. Why even bother now to do that again?
You see this when people have perhaps had failures or had other people tell them that you can't do that or you can't do this, and so then it's almost like it's their retribution on the younger people. It's like, well, I got told this when I was your age, so I'm going to tell you this. Yeah. And it's almost this because they can't think of anything new to do, they feel that it's their duty to poo-poo the young people.
Sometimes the change is sadly, you'll have a young guy all excited, and it'll be the older guy saying, "Oh, you'll get over that." Yeah, yeah. I know you're excited about what God can do in the church right now, but you'll get over that. Yeah. You'll grow out of that, which is really sad when a person talks that way. And what happens sometimes is you when you're young, you're driven by the future. Yeah. When you're old, you're in danger of being driven by the past. Mm. Now it's about not what could be, what lies ahead in the future, but 20 years ago I tried that, didn't work. Yeah. And so I'm still not trying it anymore. 20 years ago I had a failure, and that failure still drives what I do now. And now you get a lot of older guys, just wait until they retire. At this point, when I was in my 20s, I was changing the world. Now I'm just putting in time till I can retire. And Moses at that point is kind of putting in time. He's just, I've got couple of kids to raise. I've got this little business in the sheep I'm running for my father-in-law. When I was young, I dreamed of changing the world, but now I'm just trying to put some more money aside in my retirement fund and getting ready to work on my golf game. And I would say both both perspectives, if you go too extreme, either you're overconfident in your youth, you're out of touch with reality in your youth, or maybe you're also out of touch when you get old. You've let the past now harden your heart, take away your drive and your dreams and your vision. And in both cases, if you aren't careful, you end up getting stuck in an unrealistic kind of place that God doesn't intend. And it's sad when you get older and you stop growing. I think that's one of the signs that you've gotten old, is that you just stop growing and you stop learning, you stop stretching, you stop dreaming. Now I know some older leaders, they've never been more excited about what's happening. I mean, now because they've learned humility from over the years. They've learned to have realistic expectations. But they've also come to know God, and they know what God's capable of doing, and they've come to know themselves, and they know that if they stay in their lane and they do what God created them to do and what God's calling them to do, they realize, you know what, every time God has led and I've obeyed, it's always worked out. And so, I just trust God with that. And so I would just kind of say to our listeners today, where are you today? And by the way, it's interesting. D.L. Moody had a classic statement on this. He said, Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning he was nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. And so there's three segments of his life. First, he thinks way too much of himself. Then he probably thinks too little of himself and that he's not much. And then he realizes, wait a minute, with God, even if you're a nobody, if you're just an ordinary person in the hand of God, anything is possible. And it takes probably most of our listeners are in one of those places. Either we think too much of ourselves and our ability, and we're not relying enough on God, and we're overestimating what we can do. Or maybe we've kind of taken a few, punches to the gut here in leadership, and now we're timid and fearful, and we're kind of afraid to step out. We're not dreaming like we used to. We've become a little more cynical about how things will work out, how people will respond. Or maybe we're in that third phase where we've come to trust, life is hard. People don't always do the right thing. People don't respond to leadership like they should. But God, over the years, has demonstrated that he can use very ordinary, fallible people and still get some amazing things done. And so I just need to stay in harness with him and abiding in Christ and just watch and see the miracles he does in my life.
Well, we're fortunate to have the account of Moses so that hopefully for us and for our listeners, it doesn't take 40 years to learn each of those lessons. So thank you again, Richard, and until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.